off. So hi, everyone. So this is the Open Island Network event for security and risk management. So for those that are not really familiar with this type of event, so the Open Island Network is a community for people that are interested in really shifting the needle around open source communities, open source data, open source development, anything really that has to do with any open practices in the IT industry that are welcomed in the community and what we're looking to address. So again, today's topic on today's meeting is really about open source security and risk management. So hopefully you guys are interested in it. I know it can be a bit of a dry topic at times, so we try to keep it as interesting as possible. Again, before we get all going with a webinar and with a meeting, just feel free to use the chat, put in your names, where you come from, what you do. I think that's always good to know. And then, during the presentation of Stormy and all of the other folks afterwards, just feel in to pop in questions for Q&A. So Stormy is going to kick this off by a quick presentation around what she does around the communities at GitHub. And then there's going to be a 10-minute kind of quick Q&A with questions that you can put in the chat. So I'll say at this stage, I can probably just hand over to you, Stormy. So you can introduce yourself and give a quick presentation. I think you're just out of the White House, so I'm pretty sure you have something interesting to say.
I shared my slide presentation, and I had to figure out how to unmute myself. So thanks for having me here today. It's just a little bit of introduction of myself. I have 20 years in open source software, and most of my experience is with communities and how they work. I'm not a security expert per se, but community and how communities work on software is very much a part of the solution of security. And I don't think it's a dry topic. I actually think it's kind of fascinating, maybe a little scary at first and to most people, but definitely interesting. I recently moved. I was director of the open source programs office at Microsoft. And in November, I moved over to GitHub, where I'm VP of communities. So I'm actually going to use Microsoft as like a case study example here. So if it feels like I'm talking about two different jobs, I probably am. So one of the things, I think people's first reaction to like, wow, open source software might not be secure. I think often their first reaction is like, let's just not use it. And I'm just sharing two slides here to show like why that's not possible in today's world. So as you can see from these numbers that came from a Forrester study, 96% of the software out there has open source software in it. And any new software that's developed is typically 80 to 90% open source software. So that means if you decided not to use open source software, you are going to have to write 100% of your software application, while the person sitting next to you, or maybe in the house across the world, will be able to start with 80 to 90% already done and only write 10%. So if we want to make the world a better place with software, we're going to build it based on open source. And it's not just about like getting a head start and having all this free stuff to use. We've actually found that organizations that are using open source software are more innovative, and you'd have to read the McKinsey study to find all the definitions of innovative. But the one that I've often found true and really fascinating is that developers are also much more satisfied if they can use open source. I mean, some of it might just be like a basic thing of like, I didn't have to rewrite that library that I know already exists out there, and you let me use it, and that makes me a lot more happy. But it's also, I think it's working with others, being able to communicate around the globe with other developers, be able to share ideas. It's a fun way to work, and that also leads to developer satisfaction. So in a couple minutes here, I just wanted to share Microsoft as an example of how they do compliance and security. Then I did get to go to the White House meetings. I was really disappointed I didn't get to go in person because of COVID. It was a virtual meeting, but hopefully they'll have a follow-up and I'll actually get to go. But I'll share some of those conversations. And then I was going to close with GitHub's approach to open source software security, because as the platform where a lot of open source software is hosted, we are trying to help the world develop more secure software. And so I think that's interesting to everybody. So I'm going to use my time at Microsoft as an example. I wanted to share this quote from the CEO of Microsoft, Satya, because Satya was fundamental in Microsoft's shift to open source because he really believes in collaborating and enabling others. So he says that, you know, all tech companies have to work together and they need to learn to build on the ideas of others. And that is so crucial to open source software that I think it really helped us change the culture and get a lot of support. Just to show you the size of the problem at a company, I mean, Microsoft's a large company, but it's a really large problem, or a large opportunity. So Microsoft uses 60,000 different open source software components. So it's 60,000 different pieces of software that get downloaded from the internet and are open source and are used within Microsoft. And they're used in many different places. Actually, these numbers are outdated. I know for a fact it's more than 80,000 now, and it's more than what that 9.5 million is, like 11 million. There are 11 million instances of that software out there. So each of those 60,000 packages might be used in a lot of different places. And then there are like 30,000 Microsoft employees who have a GitHub account that they've associated with their Microsoft account. It's a voluntary action to do that. So we know we have 30,000 people at Microsoft that are working on open source software, or at least have an identity and are probably downloading and commenting on issues. So how does Microsoft manage all that and make sure that if there's any security issues or vulnerabilities that they're able to quickly react to that? So starting here on the left of this picture, they have a lot of tooling that automatically detects any open source software at build time. So if a developer is using open source software, they do a build, the software is going to automatically detect it. It then uses an open source project called Clearly Defined to figure out what the license is for that software. And then using a database decides whether or not that usage is just okay as is, or if they need to ask a few questions about like how this developer is going to use that software. Are they going to ship it? Is it just for internal use? And then depending on the license, it'll automatically kick off a legal and business review if needed. So it's usually a small percentage, 10 to 20% that end up kicking off a review, and it'll automatically in the tool, which is Azure DevOps, kick off that legal review. The attorney will get notified and take a look at it, maybe ask the developer some more questions and approve or not approve. Typically, they all end up getting approved once there's a conversation. Microsoft also provides release checklists. They have tools for creating notice files. It turns out just creating a notice file for the open source software in a product, if it's 80% open source software, could take a developer a week to create a notice file for a piece of software. So we automated all of that. And then we looked back at the escalations that we had over the past year, issues that had come up with open source software usage, and almost all of them had something to do with naming. People had picked a name that just didn't work well. They picked a name that was already in use, or they picked a name that implied the software did a lot more than it did, a number of problems. So we came up with a naming and governance guidance process, and the escalations went away once we were able to give people input on their name before they actually went public. And then Microsoft does a huge effort to try to encourage people to give back to the open source software community, because we know that the best use of open source software comes when you're actually interacting with the community whose software you're using. And so they have things like the FOSS fund. They implemented a FOSS fund where every month they give $10,000 to an open source software project that Microsoft's not already supporting financially, that the employees have picked for that month. And so every month employees vote for another project to receive $10,000. And then they have a lot of internal groups to share best practices, because as a company, sometimes you hire someone to do a job and they might not be familiar with open source software, and suddenly they're on an open source software project, or they're using a lot of open source software. So we found that those networking groups were even more valuable than training. There's also a bunch of training. I just wanted to give that as an example of how one company is working to do. Oh, and I forgot to say there's part of that, and then if there's ever security vulnerability for that piece of software, it immediately sends out a flag to all of those developers that are going to remove that piece of software. Should they use something else, it'll immediately give them advice. And if the security vulnerability is bad enough, it will actually prevent them from building until they resolve the problem. I would ask for questions at this point, but I think we'll just wait to the end. Just got a few more minutes here. So I got invited to go to the White House to talk about open source software security. Super exciting. It was supposed to be in person until the week before. And then I think the person organizing it, that was running it, was supposed to be the spokesperson, got COVID. She didn't look really healthy in the video call, but she did her job. And we had this awesome conversation. It was a lot of people from various US government organizations. They shared the challenges that they're having at the government level. There's a lot of tech companies present. I was actually representing GitHub. There's probably a dozen or so companies there. And then there were a lot of open source organizations that were invited. So example, like the Apache Foundation was there. And there were a lot of just open source advocates, like people who've been in the open source software community, who were speaking on behalf of open source software and how the process works. Most people were really familiar. I mean, even the government organizations that were asking us to come, they were all very familiar with open source software and how it worked. The goal was to drive improvements into the open source ecosystem, so to change the way things work, to make them better from a security perspective. The reason that they actually called this is, you're probably aware there have been a number where there were some pretty critical open source software vulnerabilities and non-open source software vulnerabilities that the ecosystem had to quickly react to. And so the idea was like, how can we prevent those from even happening? And the government stated as their goal was to get all of us that they invited to collectively agree to work together. I believe most of us already were working together. So that's the good news. And hopefully those that weren't are encouraged to participate. And you know, what was new? Like, why did they do this now? I think they did this now, one, because of the problems that had very public problems that had arisen in the previous 12 months. And so that's, you know, it was very top of mind for everybody, and everybody realized how much open source software they were using. And they also realized that they didn't necessarily know what they were using, and they didn't necessarily know if what they were using had one person working on it, or 10 people, or if there was a company behind it, or if it was someone in a country that they trusted, or someone in a country that they trusted but might actually be at war and not able to focus. So we didn't know what all we were using. And at the same time, the US government had passed the executive order that required certain security and certain protocols for open source software, which was awesome that they actually recognized open source software. But they're asking for SBOMs, for software bill of materials, for all open source software, to know like where it came from and a way to verify that it is actually what it says. The very first solution, as we were there in the meeting, that came to everybody's mind was, can't we just create a list of good and bad software? And that's the first thing everyone at Microsoft wanted. It's the first thing that a lot of people want. They just want, tell me which software is good and I'll just use that. And tell me what software is bad and we won't use that. And that's just almost untenable. If you think about Microsoft, it's using 80,000 different open source software packages, and each developer is making a decision on their own. It's really hard to maintain that list of good and bad software. Like, who is going to evaluate each one of those 80,000 packages on a regular basis? And are they going to look at them every day? Are they going to look at them once a week, once a month? What's good enough? And what exactly are they looking for? Like, maybe if I'm using something internally, I'm totally fine with a piece of software that's maintained by one person who does it in the evenings. And that's good enough because I'm just using that little library to keep my, my to-do list up in the corner of my screen, and it's okay if it breaks tomorrow. But another thing that might be shipping in Microsoft Teams or in Microsoft PowerPoint, that's probably not good enough. They want a software package that at least has, people that are able to look at it 24/7, maybe someone that gets paid to work on it so they have time to do that, or maybe they'd be willing to invest in that project if they knew they had to. So creating a list of good and bad software is just an extremely difficult solution. The second solution that people come up with is, can't we just focus on the software we use? So if we just focus on this pool that we use, we don't have to tackle all of the millions of repos that are out there. And again, it's the same problem. If you actually do an audit, you find out maybe you're not using 80,000 components, but you're probably using thousands. You're probably using a lot. So there is a project that Microsoft and Google started together that now lives at the Linux Foundation that is trying to approach a little bit of that help all the projects. So it's called Alpha Omega, and the Alpha list is a list of open source software projects that have been deemed most critical. So the ones not just used by the most components, but that are really important projects that, you know, are linchstone projects. And they're doing a heavy lift on those. So actually reaching out to those projects and working with the maintainers. And then they're doing an omega side of that, which is like identifying the most widely deployed ones, even if it's just like that little to-do list in the corner of my screen, you know, how many places are these projects used, and reaching out to them to help give them more automated tools to help fix their problems. So not so much one-on-one, but making sure that they are also aware and have tools and that we've reached out to them. So I included this slide not to brag about GitHub. Maybe I should have changed the title to not brag, but I just wanted to share, like, again, that like Microsoft's using 80,000 components, but there are 140 million repos out there. And a lot of people are working on them, like 50 million developers from around the world are working on those 140 million repos. So this is a problem that we're not going to solve with a good bad list, and it's a problem. It's a problem and an opportunity we're going to have for a long time, because these numbers just keep growing. There's like more and more awesome software being developed in the open with collaboration between people. So I wanted to talk about what GitHub is doing to help solve that software security problem. If it's not one that we can go create a good list, although we could help each company set their criteria for what's good for them and help them filter on that's possible. But what can we do for all of those projects? And so we talk about shifting left. And I included this slide just because I remember the first time I heard about shifting left, and it was used like 50 times in this one meeting, and I didn't know what they were talking about. And I'm like, what are they talking about, shifting left? What does that mean in software? And so what they're really talking about is, how do we solve the problem earlier in the life cycle? So if we wait until we have software that we're using and we've deployed and we find out there's a security vulnerability, it's really scary, it's really expensive, it's very public. There's a lot of people that we need to reach out to try to help, and it becomes a very expensive, time-consuming problem, and people get called in on weekends and evenings to help at large companies to help fix the problem. The more we can catch it earlier, the easier it is to resolve, and the less expensive and the less stressful it is. So if we can help developers as they're writing the software, before they've even, you know, sent it to anybody else, or, you know, even tested it or deployed it, it's much, much cheaper to solve a security vulnerability at that point. It's some developer time, maybe a tool running on a cloud platform, but much cheaper than trying to go out to many customers that are already using that software. And we think the only way that we're going to do that shift to the left is by working with developers. So focusing on the developers, the people writing the software. And creating secure software is a really hard problem. And we don't expect that every software developer is going to be able to become a security expert. They're going to have to know a certain amount about security, but we have security experts that spend their whole career thinking about security and how to address it. And we're not going to be able to give that same level of knowledge to all developers because they're experts in other things. We also realize that there's going to be a difference in how important security is to developers. The person that's making their own to-do list app to run in the corner of their screen, you know, they want to make sure that nobody can like hack into their to-do list and start saying, you know, go pick up Stormy's kids for her and go to the grocery store for Stormy. But they're not really worried about security at the same level that someone that's writing like an e-commerce app is. So we need to be able to give them the tools to make it easy. So as I said in the beginning, I'm not a security expert, so I'm not going to do a deep dive into each of these tools, but I just wanted to point out, like, these are the types of tools that we're giving to developers to make it easier for them. So for example, we have Dependabot, which looks at all of the dependencies that you have when you're building your software and identifies any vulnerabilities in the software any vulnerabilities that we know about, and automatically can create a pull request to fix that for you. I mean, you still have to accept it, but we're trying to make it as easy as possible to say, hey, we found something and here's the fix that we recommend. And if you like it, you can accept this pull request. We also have an advisory database that's free, it's open source. We have a full-time team that works on it and puts vulnerability notices in it, but anyone is allowed to use it, and we hope that they do. We have code scanning and secret scanning tools. Some of our tools we charge for at the enterprise level, but they are all free for open source software projects. So we really want this community of people developing open source software that the world is using to have what they need to make their products secure, because it's not feasible for a bunch of enterprises to ask individual developers to do all the work to make their software secure. So we're trying to help them do it, because if you're only one person and you're a volunteer, you might not have time to do all that stuff. And then we have a GitHub security lab, which is available to the world. We work with security researchers around the world and volunteers who'd like to come. And we're trying to help the community create secure software, just like all the other tools we're developing. But this is very much a high touch place for people to collaborate. And we're about to launch even something called open office hours, where projects can request an hour with or however much time they need with a security researcher who will actually work one-on-one with them to help them understand security issues, resolve issues. It's just kind of like a free consulting service for open source software projects. So with that, I just wanted to say, that was, how one company does open source software security and compliance work, what the White House and a whole bunch of tech companies and individuals are working on together, and then what GitHub is doing to help make developers' lives easier to create secure software. And with that, I will stop presenting and see what questions you all have.
Thanks very much, Stormy. That was great. There's a lot of different questions from different angles. So maybe start from the beginning with the first question that came in, and that was around how and where legal staff might get skilled up on this. So this was very much focused on shifting left, right? But dealing with enterprises and companies, does that have an impact on legal teams as well? Do they need to be educated around open source specifically, or have you seen any of that come up?
Yeah, and I have to say, I love working with attorneys in open source. And some of my friends in other fields are like, you love working with attorneys? And I'm like, yes, they're so much fun to talk about open source software issues with. There is a really good network of open source software attorneys that work with open source software. And I know they have an annual conference. I think two. I think the FSF in Europe has an annual legal conference, and there's also one in New York in the US. So I would recommend going there and just meeting your colleagues at other organizations. And I think that's the best way to get started. They're all willing to share and network and talk to each other.
Yeah, I can imagine that being a big issue. I just remember trying to explain to my own family what open source means and why people are giving away code for free. So yeah, it's great. That there is material out there and conferences that especially lawyers and legal people can go to. The other question sort of ties into that, but it goes then a little bit more into what is there anything, or have you seen anything where maintainers that go rogue can be reported, or there's a way to maintain that? So there was this faker.js issue that came up about like 2 or 3 months ago, where a maintainer just decided to, hey, you know what, I'm going to put on purpose vulnerabilities in here. That obviously damaged the entire open source community, but do you see a way to prevent that, or is this just something that we have to live with in the community, or is that something that GitHub is looking to address?
So it was immediately reported to GitHub, and we responded according to our it's not code of conduct or terms and conditions, but like the conditions we have in the project. I think it's also a communication thing. So it's like a vulnerability right at that point, and you need to communicate it widely and help people understand what their options are. I don't think that one, I don't think very many maintainers are going to go rogue. Like, they spend a lot of time working on their software and they're very invested in it and they care about it a lot. I do think it's important that we make sure that we continue to keep the open source software packages that we use. We need to make sure we know who the maintainers are and that we're working with them and that we're keeping them happy. It's never a good situation where one person thinks that they're responsible for the world. And if something goes wrong, everyone's going to be calling them in the middle of the night. That's not a good feeling for any one person to have.
Yeah, no, I fully agree with you on this one. So the next question goes a little bit more into, does GitHub or Microsoft have an official open source adoption policy that is going to be available for review for public, where, you know, essentially a company might be able to go in and just copy that, or say, hey, this is something we're going to implement in a similar way without having to go through that work entirely themselves?
Yeah, if you go to opensource.microsoft.com, I think it's programs and policy on the website. We actually shared a shorter version of our internal policy to kind of give you an idea of what they are. At GitHub, we're working to make all of the best practices. We're working to make our tooling, github.com, and, you know, our GitHub Enterprise products give companies the tools they need to do their own compliance programs. So we're always interested in talking to companies that are interested in creating compliance processes and OSPO's open source programs offices to hear requirements.
So there's an interesting discussion in the chat, Ben, about security as well, which kind of follows on the back of it. And, you know, there's this claim, or has always been this claim in the room, that open source software is more secure, right? We kind of assume this by default. We kind of all go out there and say this, but do you actually have ever done any research or have ever seen any numbers recently that back that up? Or do you specifically, you know, go out to actually show the value that that statement is specifically true or still holds up? Or is that maybe something which is, you know, an outdated statement in 2022?
I can't quote a study off the top of my head. So no, I don't have any research in my pocket to show. But I do think if you compared, I think one of the differences is when you buy a commercial package, you're actually buying software from someone who says, I want to give this to you for this purpose in exchange for money. And when you use open source, you're down, if you don't look at it, like where it came from and who's using it, you're downloading anything. So you could be downloading the repo that I was using to teach my son how to program. And that's probably not the one you want to depend on. So I think if you compare like Kubernetes and, you know, all of the main big projects that we're using, I think they're more secure. I don't have a study to back that up. But I think if you look at all open source software, including the repo maybe my son wrote, maybe it's not all the same level.
I think Luke made a good point in the chat, just saying, don't trust it if you didn't look into it yourself. So maybe sometimes, and I'm guilty of that as well. So sometimes we should be maybe look more into it whenever we see something. We don't have to do it certainly with the 80,000 packages that you mentioned, but in the shift left, you know, concept, and I think you were good to point that out. If I maintain 5 to 10 dependencies, that might be something that I can do, right? I might be able to actually go through 5 or 10 dependencies with 5,000 developers. I should be able to hit most of them, right? At least to kind of have a brief look over this. I'm gonna ask a question in the Q&A chat as well, which then was about the role that open source software has in mitigating, you know, attacks from state-sponsored cyber attacks, for example. Is that something that you specifically came across, or that, you know, maybe was covered in the White House as well? Like, you know, obviously attacks that are organized you know, through government entities. So you could think about, there could be someone who actually takes over a package, right? There could be an entity which specifically looks to become a maintainer and then introduce a vulnerability there. Is that something that you've ever observed or that was discussed at all?
So from the government side, I think there is a concern that the other government entities will hire, you know, I think of it like the Cold War, like spies to come work on the software. I haven't seen that. Well, the world hasn't seen that yet at any level that's concerning, but it's certainly possible, depending on how long.
Putting ideas out there for foreign entities. No, that's great. And obviously Claire pointed out that, you know, you could always pay for enterprise support. I mean, there's whole organizations that basically made a business model out of it, right? So I know that Elastic would be a company that obviously has a model where HashiCorp, you know, Red Hat and multiple other organizations do that. And I think that's good to know, right? And kind of having this in mind.
It's also important, even if you don't buy support, to support the developers. So GitHub has a program called GitHub Sponsors, where you can give money to projects that you like or appreciate or use. And when we did a poll asking if people got money, what they would do. I should have included the slide on it, but basically it meant if they got more money, they would have more time to focus on their project and more time to help make it more secure. So also just making sure the maintainers you're depending on are happy and healthy and can focus on the software.
Yeah. Just having a look here at more questions. Don't think there's any more particular questions. Actually, I have a question of a slide that you showed earlier. You showed what the most innovative companies are, and then you had some logos on there. How do you measure that? How do you measure the most innovative companies? There were like 6 or 7, including like Stripe and others that were listed.
I think I can send it to you later. I think there's a study that did it that was
Okay.
quoted there. Yeah.
Okay, I might have missed that. Folks, are there any more questions? I don't see anything in chat right now. I think we have everything answered. Yeah.
But, so Fast Company does do an annual 10 most innovative companies in the world, and GitHub made that list this year. So.
Okay. I just missed that. So Luke asked a question about the compensation issue, right? And I see that myself, having contributed to open source software previously. Do you have any ideas how we can better compensate developers, providing some of the key software dependencies? So obviously, right, we're thinking about the Apache Foundation, which provide a lot of the packages, or Mozilla. Do you think, or do you see anything that we could do on top of what we're already doing?
Yeah, I think that's a question a lot of people are asking and focusing on, and I'd welcome any ideas. So I think the main models now as a company hires them, like you're using Kubernetes and you hire a young Kubernetes person to focus on Kubernetes who's a maintainer. Foundations hire people or sponsor people or give them travel money, like the Linux Foundation gives out a lot of money to the open source software community, and companies and individuals can give the Linux Foundation money to do that. GitHub has the GitHub sponsors where you can directly give money to the projects, the developers that you care about. I think it's actually a problem we need to solve that we haven't quite figured out yet. We're also working on, a lot of people want to know, well, who should I give my money to? Like if you're using 60,000 packages, like which projects should you give money to and how much? And,
because that's the next that's the next thing that comes to mind, right? So if you're thinking about it, there's obviously the very big projects, but there's a lot of small projects as well, where maybe only 5 or 10 companies might rely on, and that project provides a lot of value, but these 5 or 10 companies don't have enough resources to fund that. So I think that's certainly an interesting question. And it might be something that could be discussed, I suppose, as a follow-up to one of the meetings that we might have. The German in me thinks about a tax naturally. So, I'm thinking about having some sort of government tax, but that might not be the right answer. So I'm just looking at time. We're about 6 minutes over. So Claire, I would hand over to you. Stormy, I would like to thank you if you want to stick around, obviously, for the rest of the meetup, it'd be great. But yeah, really, thank you so much for coming today and answering all the great questions.
Great, thank you.
Thanks so much.
Stormy. That was brilliant. Thank you. And thank you, Florian, for handing over. And hello, everyone. My name is Clare Dillon. I'm one of the co-founders of Open Ireland Network, and delighted again to be here as well. And at this point, I want to invite on stage, I think what we'll do is we've got basically 4 great panelists to actually come and share with us next, but each one has a little bit of an intro to do to give some background context about where they're coming from and some of the practices or experiences they have from their own perspective. So what I'll do is I'll ask each of those to come on in turn, and then we'll bring everyone on at the end for our Q&A panel session. And delighted to first of all invite Ger McMahon from Fidelity Investments to come on. Ger is the VP of Architecture and Head of the Application Lifecycle Management Tools and Platforms. So welcome, Ger, and I will walk through now. And if you want to give your 10 minutes on your experiences, that'd be brilliant to get us going. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I'm just going to share a few slides, make it easier to talk to rather than just listening and hearing verbal all the time. So as Claire said, my name is Ger McMahon. I head up what's called ALM Tools and Platforms here at Fidelity. And just quickly to set some context about what we're doing around security and securing the supply chain, how we operate software in Fidelity and as part of our cloud migration. But we're Fidelity around since 1946 and have always leveraged technology as the core of the business. So technology is really set in the center, and all of the business innovation and the business ideas have emanated out of that, but everything's been underpinned by technology. So we've had technology around since very, very early, since 1965 in our first computers. And so that means we've got a lot of tech, a lot of old tech, and obviously a lot of newer technology as we're embracing on our digital transformation. So in 2016, we put our first app in the cloud. Today, we have about nearly 40% of our application portfolio up in the cloud. It equates to about just over 4,500 applications. And the one thing we've noticed as part of this is the protection the data center applications gave you from a security perspective, because you had this hard perimeter around all of your applications. But as we've transitioned to the cloud and become much more open and lost the protection of that, it's really changed how everybody has to think about security, and really, rather than having centralized security on behalf of the entire firm, really security now becomes everybody's job. So as our cloud strategy, and everybody can just read the rest, I won't focus on much of it, but the vision is, we want to execute a cloud strategy. We want to enable the 16,000 developers we have in the firm, and ultimately we want to allow them to deploy securely and safely to the cloud, but at very, very high velocity. And in the center, you can see as our focus area is security. So we're establishing standards and automatic updates and security best practices, but we really want to build them in as automated guardrails, and not have every developer and every application team having to worry or concentrate about security as they're kind of doing their application development, and really trying to get them to focus all of their time on bringing the ideas our business have and translating that into products and services that delight all of our customers. So how are we going about this? So if we think about Log4j that happened over the Christmas period, it kind of really opened everybody's eyes maybe to the size of the challenge and the level of transformation and security that teams have to build now that may have not existed in the ecosystem prior. So our pillars across the top are securing our safety, securing our compliance, and securing our resiliency. So as we're building and developing, we want to push, Stormy mentioned earlier, shift left. We really want to push the securing our safety right to the beginning of the development process. If we have 16,000 developers developing, round the clock, across distributed geographically across the world, developers, we cannot allow, you just don't have the time for every developer to check every software dependency they might pull down, because if they're doing all of that work, they're not actually focusing on their business value. So as Stormy also mentioned, about 90% of your application is actually open source. So, we're looking at how do we curate open source as it's brought in as a dependency, whether it's within your application, whether it's in your CI/CD platforms, or sometimes even as an operational runtime dependency. If you're running a Docker container, you're running something like an EC2 instance. When that's booting up or starting up, what is its dependencies that it needs to download or run at runtime? So how can we secure all of that as it's coming into our environment, and curate it? So we're actually building out a curation component to front all of the kind of public repositories by which open source or external dependencies get pulled down, and curate things as it's come in. And so as we determine if something is safe and secure, we can then make that available. The first check might take a little bit of time, so we secure it, but after that, then it can be used across the firm safely and securely. But you've got to continuously scan that, as we saw Log4j, for example. That's been around in our ecosystem for 8, 9, 10, 12 years, and the version 2, and suddenly a vulnerability is discovered. So how do you continuously scan not only your software, your code, but also the artifacts that your application is building throughout and it's running in your production environment? So we need to be able to continuously scan them as well to see if there's any other security vulnerabilities identified. Is there any operational risk changes to the open source library? So if there's new later versions of it, like so Log4j1, Log4j2, for example. We still have Log4j1 within our ecosystem. How do we manage EOL, the end of life of technologies, and bake that in as part of the software supply chain continuous security? So again, but bringing that information back to the developer as feedback. So if you do create a pull request, can we execute in an automated fashion all of those policies that we want to, we have in place to say, okay, well, sorry, you've got providing the feedback in the pull request, declined. There's this library isn't at the latest version, and even to make a recommendation or automatically open a pull request that actually would bump up that open source library to a kind of an approved version, certified version. So again, the ideas here is that the platform is continuously scanning and continuously monitoring compliance to not only CVEs, but any end of life activity in a project, scanning any research that someone like GitHub might provide, or another vendor that you might use in your tool chain, that they, security research that you have access to, assessing that risk, and then obviously taking automatic actions based on whatever that is, so we can continuously protect. And then in running in production, resiliency is another big concern of ours, because if your application fails, or in Log4j, you have to bring an application down because maybe it's exposed to an external threat or external actors to take advantage of that exposure. Therefore your applications, you're not there for your customers, and your business could be unavailable. So we also want to secure resiliency while we're running in production, but we want to be able to remediate any of those issues, within hours, minutes or hours, depending on the nature of the risk, the nature of the vulnerability, and how easy it is to be exploited from externally. So, we at Christmas, the events of Log4j have really accelerated this program and really brought focus that we need large amounts of investment in this, to get this up and running. And again, at the end of the day, the end goal, the end outcome of this from a business perspective is that our developers and all our teams are focused on the business value and not focused on the writing of the infrastructure, the CI/CD pipelines, manually vetting anything on its way in to see if it can be used from, if it's a license type, it's a versioning type, a CVE type, because that will slow all of our product delivery things down. So that's where we are from a fidelity journey perspective, and I'm sure we'll talk, more when we get to the panel part.
Thanks a million for sharing that, Ger. And I just want to, we will be leaving most of the general Q&A for the Q&A session, but just because one very specific question came in, I thought I might ask it right here, just as you've been talking about it. Florian was asking, do you enforce version pinning in dependencies, or encourage, to set things to the latest version? So I'm just wondering, that's just a very specific question I thought I might ask.
Yeah, absolutely. It's actually a heated debate here at the moment on latest and pinning, and actually, we've got people with competing arguments on both sides of that house. I don't think we've got to that answer yet. Latest, obviously, if you're doing fully automated CI/CD and you're pulling down latest, you could put in something accidentally that's got a vulnerability. However, if we have really, really strong curation, we believe, yes, we can do latest, because the first latest out should actually go, but you need strong automation around the verification and security checking of that. Pinning then, pinning has a lot of problems, has more problems. So I think we'll go down latest, but once we have the security in front of it.
If it's that controversial, we might bring it up later again then, because we might have other opinions that might be someone we'll bring in. So thanks, Ger. So next we will, and we'll be hearing from Ger more in a little bit, but next we are going to bring on Brian Farrell. So Brian is the director and founder of SecureLinks. So Brian, if you would like to come to the stage, as it were, and I will go off video again, please feel free to share your slides, and good luck with this next 10-minute slot.
Thanks very much, Claire, and hopefully you can all see everything okay there.
Looking good.
Good stuff. So no, look, I'm delighted to be part of this event. I'm a big supporter of Open Ireland, and Clare does great work on all our behalfs who are involved in the sector. So I'll give you a little bit of a view on our take on security. It's maybe a slightly different journey to maybe some of the other people on the call, but hopefully it'll be interesting and we can kind of pull it all together a little bit at the end. So for me, in order to go kind of, and explain a little bit of where we've come from, our ethos as a business. So when I founded the company, which was in 2002, so it was 20 years ago now, the landscape was very different, and there was, quite a pushback in relation to accepting Linux as a viable OS or open source as a viable methodology for developing really good software. And one of those key pushbacks was in the area of security. So I'd actually been attracted to Linux because I felt it was a really securable thing to work with. You could get in, you could get your hands dirty and do, make things very fit for purpose. So in order to, the amount of advocacy we were doing at the time meant that we had to be very good at security, and we had to be actually very competent in that from a kind of a platform and application point of view. So for us, that's where we kind of started our work with security, and we've built it into the name of the company because we felt it was kind of important to do so. And it still is today. And actually the proliferation of open source has just made it kind of much more complicated as we've gone on rather than easier. Overall, security is not a security company, so I want to say that, but I think if we don't kind of leverage good security practices, we actually lose a really kind of fundamental key advantage of what open source gives in the industry. So if we're not a security company, what are we? So we're basically a kind of a dedicated Linux and open source integrator. So that's just our DNA. That's what we've been doing for the last while. In order to do that, we have to be, pretty technically skilled and have various capabilities. And over time, we've managed to do that. We've built a strong kind of industry reputation. And we do what you'd expect from most kind of integrators. We provide software, services, support, training, all those kind of classic things. And we're lucky to have sectors, significant enough customers in all sectors. We've never really verticalized because Ireland doesn't really kind of lend itself to that. We went wherever we felt there was core critical open source and Linux work that needed to be done well. And that's underpinned for us by our kind of key industry partnerships. So we, no surprise, we partner with kind of all the big players in this space. We've been a Red Hat partner for a very long time, and they've been curating software in this space for even way longer than we started working. So, they can bring significant advantages, especially in relation to security and making sure that from the applications that they curate, that they're kind of well-minded for us. So we've got, very detailed knowledge around that, though we work with all distributions and, we work with very open source, application stuff as well. So we're broadly busy in kind of four main areas. The sort of traditional areas for us would have been in relation to that, what we call an intelligent and secure open source infrastructure. So making sure people can leverage that. There's something that's kind of very manageable, and that includes obviously, security, within that. More recently, for the last couple of years, that's kind of, changed quite a lot. We're much busier now with all the emerging technology areas. So with containers, and obviously Kubernetes would be our kind of automation and, our orchestration engine of choice. We do a lot of work with automation around Ansible, and we were traditionally also very strong in the whole kind of high performance computing area, and that's kind of led us very nicely by leveraging things like Kubernetes into the areas of machine learning and artificial intelligence. And we do a lot of very interesting work for people in that space as well. And all our projects and all our work and all our supported customers are, pretty much leveraging the full range of, data centers, public and hybrid cloud models as part of that. So each of those areas has its own level of complexity and security challenges. And, we do our best to resolve those for our customers at every layer, right? So that involves having, really strong awareness and, being really good around all the fundamentals about IT infrastructure. And that includes making sure that when the frameworks that they want to work with are being deployed, they're being done to best practice. And if they're going to be moving from A to B with some of their data, that's all done in a very highly secure manner. And what we are, very good skills around things like hardening, which we've been doing for a long time in terms of making sure that infrastructures are robust, and any additional tooling. And that's an area that's changing all the time. There's some very, very interesting tooling coming out now to help us in that sort of frameworks environment for how we do. And as we've slowly leaned in more to the sort of DevOps side of things over the last few years, it's really a big help for us if we work with companies who are using, a software development lifecycle and there's security built into that, right? So again, that's, as Stormy said earlier, that's that kind of shift left. And as Jared was explaining, they seem to be doing a really, really good job there in Fidelity in relation to managing that. And it's really a combination of those two areas that gives you good environments. And for us, as I say, best practice deployments around some very complicated systems. I mean, Kubernetes is sort of inherently insecure by nature, and there's a lot of work that has to be done in putting that in place. And then if you are working with, DevOps, for us, if we're working with DevOps customers and they're doing stuff that allows them to detect vulnerabilities within their code they're building, to mitigate, remediate those quickly, and to, manage their software inventory, and potentially also understand where they sit in terms of maybe compliance and licensing from a governance point of view for some components they're working with. All of that stuff really for us is a kind of a win-win, and probably from our perspective is where we're making a contribution towards trying to improve security and mitigate risk in the industry locally here. So that's kind of us. I won't go any further than that. I say we're just established in the space for a long time, too long maybe in some ways. We've always had security there because it's been a necessity with open source, and you have the option with open source to really understand what you're doing. But the complexity around this has really gone off the scale, I think, and I do sympathize hugely with people who are using components now for open source, because it's so ubiquitous. I think there's a danger that we can get a bit lazy and assume somebody else is doing it and minding that security piece, but the chances are they're not, and maybe quite the opposite actually. So I think software supply chains are really going to be, even more important as we go forward, and not an easily solvable thing, and it's something that we're learning about all the time. And I'm really interested to hear what all the other speakers will have today to say, because I'm learning here as well. And that's me, Claire. Thanks.
Thanks a million, Brian, and thanks for sharing that. I just when we first started talking about bringing Open Ireland Network together, it was a little bit about actually making people aware of the great work that's happening in Ireland. I know Ger gave a great story, and it's just, not everyone unfortunately has the same resources as Ger, so it's fantastic to see the kind of services that are available to help organizations on this journey. So thank you for sharing that.
You're very welcome.
Again, we'll hear from Brian in a little while, but next I want to bring on Martin Callanan, and Martin is one of the founders of source code control, but also very experienced in the area of open chain. So we're going to hear a little bit from him about the standards in this area, yeah, take it away, Martin.
Thank you, Claire. Can you see my screen? Let me just
Not yet, but it's coming, and here it is. And just try the presentation mode.
Yep.
All good.
Thanks, Claire. Hello, everybody. My name is Martin Callanan. I'm a director and founder of Source Code Control. So what we do, we provide services primarily to companies developing software to manage and control risks associated with the use of third-party components and libraries in that software development process. Primarily, they would be open source components, but not necessarily always open source components. Now, just want to start just by clarifying, first of all, what are we managing in that supply chain and why is it so difficult? So when we talk about supply chain risk, we're talking about, if you look at the development process here on this image, the developers, the benefit of open source in software development is this ability to reuse and share code, so you're not constantly reinventing the wheel. So, modern software development's already been touched on. Applications include up to 90% third-party components and libraries, which is great for rapid development, but it comes with its challenges and obligations. So at the left, you've got developers putting in code from sites like GitHub. You might reuse code from other projects. You might outsource some of your software or all of your software developments. We've seen that. So the delivered solution will be kind of a mishmash of third-party code and your own proprietary code, leveraging those third-party components. Now, the delivered solution may be an open source solution. It may be a proprietary closed source solution. And as been touched on earlier, pretty much all software that's delivered today will include third-party components. Now, if you just look at one of those components, they have a number of attributes. The first attribute would be related to intellectual property and licensing. So there will be license information. There are documented over 2,000 variants of open source licenses. And other data points related to the license will be the copyright holder. So typically, somebody would put a copyright statement on the license associated with the component. Then getting into security and vulnerabilities, there will be a version number. And sites like the National Vulnerability Database, where research happens in flaws in software, you can cross-reference the version number to see if there's any known vulnerabilities related to that component. The example already given is log4j, and I'll talk about log4j further into this. Then there's the issue of dependencies. So you put in a component from, say, GitHub. When you build your software, it may have dependencies, and those dependencies may have dependencies which are referred to as transitive dependencies. And each of those dependencies will have the same data. They'll have a license, they'll have a copyright statement, they will have a version number, and potentially you could be pulling in a dependency with a known vulnerability. And then the usage of the components in the application has a bearing on the obligations of the licenses. So is it an internal application that's being developed? Is it going to be distributed externally from your organization? Is it a cloud solution? So there's licenses with different obligations which can impact an organization based on that use case. So if you look at, say, this is off NPM. So Spook.js is a tiny bit of code. You can see there's 13 dependencies. You can see there's a license, which happens to be the GPL license. And the GPL license has an obligation not only to give copyright attribution, but if you use that to create a derivative work, so you use that in your application, which you distribute to a client or put it as a cloud solution, there could be an obligation for you to make the source code of all the software available to the user. So if you've got a commercial value in the software you're developing, it's a closed source solution, then that potentially would be a big risk to your organization. So that is a challenge. And if you look at it purely from a security perspective, there's an increase in issues related to components and libraries which are downloadable from these public repositories. Now, it doesn't mean to say that open source components and libraries are becoming less secure. First of all, there's more code available. So more code means there's more flawed code. Secondly, the research into issues related to security in all software has improved, and so you get more reports about vulnerabilities. And I'm going to use log4j as an example going forward. There is also the issue of a new type of security threat, and this is where the term supply chain really came into its own. There's evidence of malware being put into public code repositories, and the developer pulls down the components, so that malware ends up being delivered to customers and can be exploited at a future date when you've delivered the solution to a customer. So unwittingly, you could pull in one of these components and put your customers at risk with the software that you supply to them. Now, log4j is a great example. It's been very high profile. The reason why it's been so high profile is, first of all, it's widely used. So a lot of software, particularly Java applications, use log4j for logging. And secondly, it's highly exploitable. So the National Vulnerability Database, there's a screenshot there from that website related to log4j. It's rated as critical with the highest rating of 10 out of 10. Now, the other thing is malicious actors, hackers, are getting better at exploiting vulnerabilities. And the National Vulnerability Database is a public domain website. So as soon as the report is issued in the public domain, hackers, bad actors get access to that information. So they have created better tools for trying to exploit vulnerabilities. So within 72 hours of that disclosure, there were 100 attacks a minute around the world trying to exploit that vulnerability. So the challenge for developers and maintainers of software is a race to remediate issues related to vulnerabilities and beat the hackers trying to exploit the known vulnerabilities. And what I would say about Log4j is there's nothing unique about what's happened with Log4j. We've been here before. There was a massive security breach that Equifax had in the US that was related to open source projects. We've had Heartbleed. There's vulnerabilities reported, on a frequent basis. Now, part of the challenge is, the challenge of software companies and software developers is this pressure to meet deadlines. So you've got commitments to customers with features you've committed. Maybe you contractually have to deliver a certain number of versions of software a year. Developers are always pressured to meet those deadlines. What this graph is showing you on the screen is, since the disclosure of the Log4j vulnerability, which, as probably you're aware, is very high profile, it's covered widely in the press. What this graph is showing you that post the vulnerability being disclosed and patches available, developers were still downloading across the world the vulnerable version of Log4j. And that's not for any malicious reason. It's simply because they search for Log4j and the first hit they get is a particular version, they put it in. They're not checking its latest version. So unwittingly, again, the vulnerable version of Log4j is still being distributed into projects. And there was a recent report by Qualys that 30% of mainstream applications that use Log4j are still vulnerable to be exploited. So that's kind of the challenge. So how do you remediate those challenges? So there are tools generally referred to as software composition analysis tools, which can scan code and create an inventory, sometimes referred to as software bill of materials, which I'm going to talk about in a few moments. So an inventory of all the third-party components, libraries, dependencies, version numbers, any known vulnerabilities, license information, copyright information. So when Log4j was announced, we got approached by a lot of companies who never track third-party components in their code, panicking, and we were generating reports and identifying if Log4j was present, what version, and so on and so on. So the latest version is version 2.17.1, for instance. But even when the first fix for the disclosure that made the press, that created another vulnerability. So very quickly, there were 4 updates to Log4j within the space of a week or two. So that kind of is an idea of the challenge. Now, because of these issues, there has been an increase globally in regulations, kind of forcing software companies to address this issue. I'll give you an example from the United States, but there are similar examples across Europe and other parts of the world and vertical sectors. But last year, the US infrastructure is being hacked continuously or trying to be hacked by state actors. And so there was an executive order produced by the Biden administration about improving the nation's cybersecurity. And within that executive order, there's a statement that any software supplied to government organizations should be accompanied with a software bill of materials, which you can think of as, I refer to it as an inventory, but you can think of it like the ingredients list on food packaging. So if you've got a nut allergy, in the shop, you can check the food packaging of what's the ingredients of the food. So similarly with software, you could take a software bill of materials and you can see the makeup of the software. So if you have a situation like Log4j, where all of a sudden there's an announcement, there's massive vulnerability in a specific version or range of versions of Log4j, the idea is that the customer of the software can view the software bill of materials and see if Log4j is present, what version, and then take action about remediating that, whether it's pressuring the supplier or you fix it yourself. And that has been passed into law. In Europe, there's similar guidance. So the EU have produced publications related to cloud software, should include software bill of materials, be tracking third-party components for vulnerabilities. There's a similar publication related to IoT in certain industries. So for instance, the payment card industry, they have a secure software development lifecycle standard. And in that standard, it says software developers should be tracking third-party components, version numbers, are there vulnerabilities, and a strategy to fix those vulnerabilities. So getting into more about, what's the guidance? How do you manage this kind of problem? So there's a talk about shift left earlier in some of the previous discussions. So tools like I mentioned software composition analysis. You can integrate SCA into your supply chain, so you can get alerted to vulnerabilities, this shift left concept. And the final piece that I just want to touch on is there's best practices and standards which you can refer to. So the first one is the Open Chain project. The Open Chain project, we're a partner of the Open Chain project and contribute to it. They have created and maintain an international standard, ISO 5230. Now, this is a process standard which guides you what processes do you need to put in your software development process in order to manage all the issues I've just talked about. And the idea is if you're a software company, you can conform with that standard and you get a badge saying your conformance, which you can share with your customers, partners, you can share it on your website. So it means you've got a process for managing that supply chain issue. SPDX is a standard related to Open Chain, which standardizes the way you articulate the metadata, which I refer to related to the individual components. So the way you communicate license and copyright information in a standard way, which is machine readable and human readable. The NTIA, which is the National Telecoms Industry Association in the US, they've got this project, Software Component Transparency, and they're trying to standardize and define what should be in a software bill of materials. And that was what was referenced in the executive order. And the final piece which you can reference is OWASP have a project called Cyclone DX, and they're trying to standardize what is a software bill of materials, what should be in a software bill of materials, and also providing tools that can automatically generate those software bill of materials. And with that, I am finished.
Thank you so much, Martin. It's so fascinating to see like the response that had to be made and in fact the trends and standards that are emerging around this space. So thank you so much for sharing that. And I know there were some, again, questions in the chat that we will save until our last panelist, Michelle Kearns, who is head of IT for Boots Ireland. I'll invite Michelle now on stage, virtual stage, to share some of her experiences and approaches in the context of security. So Michelle, if you would like to turn on your camera and come off mute.
Yep, here we are now. Good afternoon, everyone. How are you all keeping? Florian, you'll be delighted to know that there is someone else from Donegal on this call, and her name is Carmel Fallon. Hi, Carmel. Carmel is one of my colleagues, and she's up in Letterkenny up there. So you can drop in and say hello to her someday, Florian. But my name is Michelle, and I'm from Boots Ireland. So I've been the head of IT there for nearly a year now. And my story is completely different from our previous presenters because we're at a very different stage in our journey from an open source perspective. When I first joined Boots, I had a chat with our head of engineering at the time, Steve Westgarth, and it was just very simply, what are we doing in kind of the API area? What are we doing in different programs? And what about open source? And he just burst out laughing and said, security, say no. So we've been kind of going on that journey to who do we need to speak to? What do we need to do? How can we make sure that we're selling a story that people understand and people get? Because I suppose when we talk about open source, there are so many questions that come from the teams. Sometimes even the very basic, what is open source? Because when you're talking to a developer community or people who are familiar with the terminology, it's fine. But if you're trying to sell that to a leadership team, they're not going to know what is open source. Why do we care if it's open source? And it's very, very funny when you kind of think that when people want to use a software program, they just want the software program to work. They want it to be good. They want it to do what they want it to do. But at a very high level, they don't actually care where the code comes from, whether it's open source or not. What does that even mean? So we're on a journey now of chatting to the teams, to making sure we're getting everybody on board, and then seeing what can we do. So my background is in healthcare informatics originally, and I spent a lot of time in not-for-profit with a not-for-profit company. So as part of my work there, what we had looked at is how could we create an open source healthcare record for patients? What would that look like? What would we need to do? And I think that's something that, we've started on that journey. And now that I'm in my different role, I want to see how can we continue it? How can we support healthcare in Ireland? What can we actually do? What can we actually share? But before we actually even get to that space, we need to get what we're actually trying to do across to people, get them to understand open source more and get them to buy into it. And I think one of the only, it's so fascinating to just hear everyone today and see the journeys they're on. And you see, the massive positives when you have a security issue, when something goes wrong, and then you can kind of bail each other out, support each other, get moving onto a project. So I suppose I'm here today with a kind of ask of where are we going to go? Where are Boots going to go? We don't have a defined journey yet, but we're hoping to work with Clare and the team to see how can we map out that journey? How can we work with others on that journey? So I hope, Clare, you'll have me back in another couple of months and I'll be able to say we've open sourced this, or we've done something magical. That's putting a lot of pressure on myself and the teams, but they're amazing teams that I work with. So I'm sure we'll get to that stage eventually. It is a long journey, and I suppose I'd love to maybe connect with some people afterwards as well. And if anybody has any of their stories to share about how they're selling it to their board and to how they got things over the line, because what we're finding is people are actually interested. They do want to move into that open source space, but it's just how do we do it and where do we go with our next steps? So as I said, I will be documenting as I go along and, seeing how we're actually getting on, what we've had to do, where our stumbling blocks are. And I'll be happy to share when we're moving forward and how we're progressing. So Clare, that's pretty much from me and from my perspective. So if anybody has any questions or anything, please do.
Thank you. And thanks, Michelle, because you've just outlined exactly one of the reasons why we decided to put together the Open Ireland Network, which was so that we can share these challenges and explore the answers together. And I think that's brilliant. Thank you for sharing that. So can I ask now Martin and Brian and Ger to come back on our virtual stage? I always feel weird saying that, but turn your cameras back on. And we are now going to have a quick chat about everything that you just were talking about. And I think I'll start with Michelle's question, right? Because you've all described your backgrounds and your experiences in a different way and how you've been coming at this. But this kind of challenge, this common challenge that everyone seems to have for folks who are not embedded in this ecosystem and don't understand the latest about what's going on. And when you want to actually back this idea that open source is somehow not secure, what are the best resources that you can point to that helps people, you yourselves and others on this journey, to actually help them feel like there's a comfort in using open source? Some of that is that we're all doing it together. But can I ask if anyone has some suggestions from that perspective?
Claire, I'd like to comment on that.
Please
so fundamental to that is training.
Mm-hmm.
So I mentioned the Open Chain project, which is a community project. So anybody can contribute and sign up to be involved. They've got an education program. So they've created a curriculum. We've created a training course for explaining what open source is, what the challenges with it, how do you manage it, how can you adopt Open Chain, and the types of people we've had come through that course. We've had from companies, legal counsel. We've had CEOs, CTOs, CIOs, we've had architects, developers, and all of them walk away. So I didn't know any of that about open source. But without that understanding, you can't understand the benefits of open source properly. I'll give you an example. One of the companies we worked with, large manufacturing company, and they asked us to come in and do their training course, various stakeholders. And in the kind of initial questioning, why you're here and all that sort of stuff, they were saying, we're an old-fashioned company. We're not sure about open source. We definitely will not allow our developers to contribute to open source. So we went through the whole program. We ended up creating a policy for them and this, that, and the other. About 3 months later, the person who invited us in contacted me and said, Martin, just so you know, we're now allowing all our developers to contribute. And the reason why that's important, so for Boots, for instance, is first of all, it's a great way to recruit developers. Developers want to be contributing to open source projects. It means their skills are current. And if you block that, you will struggle to recruit developers going forward.
Thanks, Martin. And that curriculum that you were talking about, that's available freely then from the Open Chain?
Yeah, the curriculum is, we've extended it and built around it. But yeah, it's end to end. What is open source? What are the different licenses? What are the obligations?
Brilliant.
And what is Open Chain? Yeah.
So that sounds amazing, and hopefully we will get more folks that are actually stepping forward to take the training. Is there anything else, even maybe before we get to kind of formal training? Any other resources that anyone is familiar with that helps people on this journey and to feel comfort about this? I'll note as well that there was one of the questions in the chat, for example, was around whether or not there are public databases available for vulnerabilities. Someone was asking earlier about whether or not there was actually statistics available to show the relative security of open source code versus proprietary source code and things like that. So I'm just putting it out there. Anyone else got any references, material, or any background information on that sort of thing? I for example, was thinking about that National Vulnerabilities Database. So that actually stores proprietary code vulnerabilities as well as actually open source vulnerabilities. I remember someone telling me, though I haven't looked at it lately, that actually there's about a 50-50 kind of split in terms of the actual vulnerabilities listed. So that's one indication that it's not that there's very many more in open source, and actually probably not all the proprietary ones are there. So you might even conclude that there might be more in closed source. That's me leading the witnesses there. But anyway, anyone else got any ideas in terms of what other things might help raise awareness, apart from formal training, around this the security of open source and how to address that?
Yeah, Claire, I'd happily talk to that, because I suppose over lots of years, right, we've had to meet with organizations who are new to adopting open source, and often it comes in by stealth into lots of organizations. Maybe that hasn't been the case so far with Boots, and I've been in meetings where that has definitely been the case, where we say we've no open source here, and somebody will say, well, actually we've been running it for the last year in this area and all that kind of stuff, which is maybe good and bad as well. But ultimately, I think peer review is really helpful with sort of C-level type sales. So I'm sure there are organizations, and people are generally very I found anyway, people are very happy to talk in Ireland particularly, and share stories about their successes and challenges with that. So it could be, and there may be some clients that we've had in the past who might be helpful, where we could get you to talk to people who have made that journey, and where's the good starting point. Obviously, there are easier places to start if you're actually going to be developing software in-house, and there's people with very specific expertise in that area. Our expertise around infrastructure is making sure that when you go to actually start to deploy that it's very manageable for like everything from a security point of view, day to operations, and then there is a training element potentially around that as well at that point. But I think the peer review thing, I used to really be delighted. Like, we needed very brave customers back in the day, a long time ago, to adopt Linux. We don't really need them to be brave anymore because of most of the systems that are now in place. But they do need to kind of feel confident and that they're not the only person doing something. So I think that would be a thing. And that's where that kind of peer review for C-level conversations is very helpful in convincing people to move.
I love it. We might trial the whole kind of like open source. You don't have to be brave at all. You can be.
I know, yeah, not anymore.
You can be a scaredy cat and still use it. It's all good. But thanks for that, Brian. That's brilliant. Ger, anything that you would like to add in terms of helping people on the journey?
Yeah, so yeah, I mean, very similar years ago, because obviously Fidelity is financial services, heavily regulated, especially in the United States. And a lot of times we use, if you take something like Spring, right? The Spring framework, right? It's really the backing of every single Java application pretty much on the planet now, and a lot of vendors provided a kind of commercial or, closed source version of that. And when we started in trying to say go purely open source versus a commercial back, we kind of find, well, you're paying for all the support, but ultimately anytime you had a question or an issue, you had to go to that vendor. And we were finding more and more people were ending up going to GitHub or going to the internet to find, because the world is using the open source. So the expertise was in the community or the open source community. And we found you're paying for all this, but you were actually getting better support, better information. You had access to a much wider amount of information from the open source world. So that was the kind of leverage that we had into, using open source versus closed source. And then what we set up was a kind of like an informal OSPO office, whereby somebody had to request use of a particular open source library. So there was a formal process. So it wasn't that the internet's wide open, off you go. It was more that you had to go request it. It was reviewed from a licensing perspective, a vulnerability perspective, and then you could bring that in and it's approved for use. And it's, again, like Martin said, it's an educational process then with all the developers to make sure you go through the right channels and the right process. And that builds confidence at the organization level that this is a better way of working, a better way of operating. And I think Brian said as well, the talent, right? It's like the people coming out of university today, the young talent, the new next generation of technologists, they're born in GitHub, they're born in the open source world. If you have a closed shop, actually, first of all, attracting that talent could be very difficult. Then you have all that time of training them on proprietary things. So even retention of talent could be very difficult. And that slows the business down. So we actually view open source as a business accelerator and kind of a differentiator for market share.
Yeah, that's a great point, Chair. I mean, I think I remember, and this was before the pandemic, but looking at some of the retention rates for developers in London City, I think in financial services, and it was something like 18 months, like they were just hopping jobs, and you kind of think about the idea that, I mean, I think part of it might be that all of the financial services companies now working, like they're starting to work together on, on similar types of frameworks. The more commonality you have, the easier it is for people to be able to onboard, and that's so necessary now with how people are bringing people on, but also being able to retain people, knowing that they're not going down some sort of legacy route or something like that, but that they're always on the latest version. So yeah, thank you for that. It brings in one of the questions that came through to the chat, which was a question specifically about what third levels can do to actually increase the level of security awareness and best practices with developers and IT professionals that might be coming out of university. So does anyone have a particular view on that? Maybe Michelle, I'll come to you to see, I mean, from a training perspective, when you're thinking about hiring folks or even professional development, any thoughts about how or where there should be an additional emphasis on security and from a third level perspective?
I think from a security perspective, it comes back to that understanding. And as you said, it is sometimes you're pushing an open door with people who are going, open source evangelists, let's do it. We know what we're doing here. But it's more of how do you explain it to everybody else? Because if you're really passionate about it and you believe in it, it's nearly like, how do you, open source for dummies? how are you going to explain it to other people? How do you explain it from your perspective? Exactly, pretty much what everyone has been saying here today on how, it is secure. You just have to make sure that you are getting the right message across. So it's even giving people the tools to talk to the C-suite, to get in there, to make sure they're having the right conversations with the right people, and that they're not just going, it's good, trust me, that there's actually, they have the research, they have the backing, and they have the examples of different companies to say, look what they've done, look what they've achieved. And I think, Jared, what you were saying about it being accelerating the ways of working and all the rest of that is a really interesting way to sell that to a board, I think, as well. Because yes, absolutely, with developers, I mean, there's coming out of college now, and as you said, the open source it is the only way. That's the way we want to go. That's the way we want to have it. And you don't want to shrink your talent pool. But if you get out there and say, look, that happens with obviously in-house software as well. If you have your developers leave And then there's the no knowledge transfer, and we all know about bad coding documentation. We could have a whole other session on that, and you're stuck with this bunch of code that no one's really sure how to work or what's actually going on. So I think they're probably, you know, those business around the business of how do you do open source, really. That's where I think that training is needed, just to say, from a business perspective, this is what we need, this is how we understand it, and this is what's going to help your business grow, and this is how you're going to attract talent.
Thank you. And like, I think that links back to what Martin was saying as well. I'll note as well, we've just closed a survey for Open Ireland Network around the skills gap. And I was actually surprised about the number of people in our working group session as we were building the survey who were looking and focusing on this non-technical skills. So to your point and to what Martin suggested earlier, it seems like actually the biggest gap is getting everyone else who's not technical to understand both the opportunity and the risks and the processes and things like that give comfort. So yeah, thank you so much for that. I will ask now another question that came specifically from the chat around SBOMs. By the way, I love the term SBOM. I hadn't really heard that said out loud before. It made me think of F-bombs. I'm thinking, yeah, you drop the F-bomb if you didn't get your S-bomb right. But nonetheless, it's a great term. And it was specifically from Steve to say, you know, are there any like public registries of SBOMs or like tested software or somewhere where it's like, I was kind of thinking like a trust pilot for you know, commonly used SBOMs or commonly used components. I remember Stormy was mentioning how challenging that would be, and yet at the same time, I'm assuming that someone's attempting it somewhere other than the Alpha to Omega kind of project she was talking about. But does anyone else know of anywhere else that folks could look if they were looking for how to trust a given component?
So I've got a couple of comments on that. So first of all, a public repository of SBOMs potentially is a risk in its own right.
Okay.
So if you think about it, if you publish, anybody's got access to a software bill of materials, then good people and bad people can access that data. So if you've got all the components, version numbers of the makeup of the software, you can start cross-referencing with the National Vulnerability Database and other data sources, see any of those components vulnerable, then you know that organization's got vulnerable software and you can try and exploit it. So where SBOMs are shared, you have to be very careful about that. As regards, one of the challenges with SBOMs is consistency. And there's work to kind of standardize what should be in the software bill of materials. So the tools that are used to create SBOMs will vary company to company. I've seen SBOMs in different formats. I've seen JSON files, I've seen text files, I've seen spreadsheets, I've seen PDF documents. So there's like a consistency. There are projects that are certifying SBOMs, kind of validating, and you get a stamp to say it's accurate and things like that. So it's all work in progress really, but there are a lot of projects. I did mention Cyclone DX, which is an OWASP project with various contributors. So they are defining what should be in an SBOM, and they're providing tools, both open source and commercial, that can create those SBOMs that meet that standard. So it's got to watch that space.
Okay, thank you very much. Now there's a couple of questions just come in. I'm looking at the various different sources here. So I'm just going to go through a few of them because we have about 5 minutes left. So here's one from Luke, and he was saying, what about specific issues with open source licenses? Is that an element in security checking or is it considered separately? He mentions that Google's, among others, ban Pharo GPL, giving a feeling of insecurity, even if it's more about commercial issues. So any specific open source licenses that feel like they give more security than others?
Well, I've got a comment on that. So we manage security vulnerabilities in components and licensing at the same time, so concurrently. And I mentioned there's like 2,000 different licenses with obligations and increased litigation. But imagine a situation where you've got proprietary software solution and all of a sudden you are forced to share your source code. For example, Tesla were under duress forced to share the source code of their navigation system, which was commercially sensitive. You know, they're leading the EV market, and so other car manufacturers could see how they did that, and also you can see how to exploit it. So it does create a security issue. But the whole open chain thing of can you identify the open source components in your code, dependencies, license information, and also when you distribute your software, are you meeting obligations of those licenses? And you can include overlay security in that kind of supply chain management.
Okay, so thank you, Martin. And I think this is actually tied to this extra question now from Michael Byrne. He was saying that he works in the semiconductor business, and they're used to having responsibility for what their product's output is their responsibility, but the lawyers make them run their code through an SCA to remove any open source from embedded code. But what are your views then about who does the responsibility lie with on issues and vulnerabilities in third-party software? How to kind of manage that from a vendor perspective, or how you're doing that? Does that resonate with people, Ger?
Yeah, I think for us, if it's vendor supplied, then it's back to the vendor to remediate and provide a new set of software. You got a contract, you got license, etc. You think of something like Log4j, for example, it's an open source library. The community is responsible. So you had people who actually went in and the community provided the remediations, and you as an organization have to constantly be scanning. So using your SCA tools is the correct, identifying the risk, and then, whatever action. But if it's open source project, then it's the community at large who will kind of take action on it.
And in many respects, sometimes it's that shared risk management can sometimes be a comfort blanket in itself, right? It's not you alone that has the problem, it's everyone. So it's
everybody, correct.
Yeah. So at least there's a shoulder to cry on, I guess, in that respect, if something goes wrong at the very least. I
think sorry, Claire, I was going to say it has come up like there are companies who were, in the business of being acquired, for example, and, they had to run due diligence on the code, and the exercises around that and where that took them was really problematic for them. So that's why I think even the founders of White Source, which is an SCA tool, they founded White Source because of that issue that they had in a previous life, to specifically address that type of thing. So anytime you're providing code like that, you do have to try and be able to point to the source of it, and you get the source code and be able to validate it in some shape or form, I think.
Yeah, we do those audits for investors.
Yeah,
we have never ever found an application without issues, both licensing and security.
I believe that.
So another good tip to say this is important stuff to get right. I'm going to finish up with one last question, and a very quick one because we don't have much time left, but I'm kind of thinking about the fact that, many of the folks here are either service companies that are helping organizations, and that's obviously one route to go down I'm preempting my question here, or in large organizations where you have resources to do this. If you're a smaller organization who are maybe starting on this journey and maybe, looking to see what steps they would take to get this right, can you recommend what would be the first step you would take to address this issue within that kind of small to medium sized organization, and without, of course, notwithstanding the fact that they could contact your good selves in our services that we're here today, but apart from that, can you give one tip to organizations in terms of what you should do to start on this journey towards secure, risk managed open source software? Brian, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I think, well, if you go into with the view that you have to have a software delivery development lifecycle approach for starters, because at least if you have that and there's steps within that, and each of those steps can be potentially secured to some extent, and there's no real major barrier to cost-wise to entering in that. But if you can secure a software development lifecycle, I think. It's not easy always, but you can do it and you can approach it that way. But you'd have to be starting it with that something formal that you can, put down on a page and say at each step, we'll take these steps and see what remediations might be.
Brilliant. Break down the challenge. Thank you, Brian. Martin, what about you?
For me, there's a wealth of reference material. There's best practices now for secure software lifecycle and managing licensing. So I mentioned OpenChain as one. Cyclone DX, but also companies publishing how they manage open source. So Google have published their open source policy for their developers. Microsoft have done the same. Verizon have done the same. A lot of the car manufacturers are doing the same thing. So there's plenty of reference material now to, just take ideas from there, what works for you, and gradually build a program. My other advice would be don't try to bite off too much at the start. Take small steps start implementing things step by step.
Thank you, Martin. And I'll note as well that Florian just shared a great one from Red Hat as well there. So thank you, Florian. Michelle, what about yourself? See, Florian's
the Open Ireland Network.
Oh yeah, that's it. We'll all learn together. That's a good one. I love that one.
Well, I genuinely, I would say, reach out, look at the, look at all the information that's been shared here today, and that people are willing to share. They're willing to share their stories, and I think it is just reach out to people, who's done it similar. Are there similar companies that are trying to do the same thing as you've already done? And if they are, do you need to do it, or where can you improve, or what can you do? But absolutely, reach out to networks and reach out to people.
Thanks, Ger. Thanks, Michelle. And now to Ger. Final word, Ger.
Yeah, I think, on top of what everybody else has said, there are companies out there, this is a software problem for everybody in the world who uses software. So it's not unique to one company. But if a company is just starting out, outside of the tremendous amount of material you can get and reference material you can read, not to say sell GitHub, but say GitHub if you get a GitHub, you get Dependabot, right? There's some easy wins where you don't need to have the expertise, but you can, take a vendor or look in a product. But to me, if you connect it to your source code at the time, you shift it right, left, and you can do that out of the box now for not a huge amount of effort. You can leverage all the expertise of that organization and really protect yourself in the back end. So it's a great first start.
Brilliant. Well, I just want to say thank you to all our panelists for sharing their own stories and their background. And I hope we'll see you again all in future events and things like that, so we can all share. Couple of questions too late. I might send them on to you, and we might actually put them out in the show notes or something like that afterwards. But because we see you there, Steve. We'll continue this conversation again. I just want to say a big thank you to Ger, Brian, Martin, and Michelle. It was wonderful to have you all here, and I'll hand you back to Florian to close us out. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Well, there's really not much more for me to say, is there, after this, Claire? So again, thanks everyone for attending. I think it was a great session. It was good. I think we had a great mix from people on today, from small organization, medium size, and obviously, Stormy talking about a very big product out there called GitHub, which obviously affects loads of people. So I'll be really looking forward to see many of you again, on the next of these sessions. And again, just, stay in touch, use the website, reach out to people that were on today. I think there's a lot of interesting questions to be discussed. And yeah, maintain your software. that's probably all we can take away from this session, right? Make sure that you need to stay on top of the ball. You don't want to end up in the newspaper, as the HSE will probably be happily tell you. So thanks very much and have a good evening.